Good afternoon, everyone. It's wonderful to see you all, and thank you so much for being with us. Tonight, it's our 99th consecutive week of America at Crossroads. Like so many other weeks lately, this week has brought more terrible news out of Ukraine. It's hard to envision how this war will ever end. Like most of you, I look forward to each Wednesday from 5 to 6 to try to make some sense of what's happening in the world. And this week's program brings a very important issue to the center stage. We welcome Kathryn Stoner of Stanford and Minxin of Claremont McKenna College, a conversation with Stanford democracy scholar Larry Diamond to talk about China and Russia, an alliance of autocracies. Thank you to all three of you for being with us tonight. Next week, we welcome PBS NewsHour's the legendary Judy Woodruff and former editor of the Washington Post, Marty Barron, together with Jeffrey Cowan, who's director of the USC Annenberg Center on Communications, Leadership, and Policy. It should be an outstanding program. Is it possible to restore trust in journalism in America and the world? The following week, Lieutenant Colonel Alex Vindman will be with us. Colonel Vindman is a foremost authority, as most of you know, on the Ukraine, and he'll give us his thoughts on how the war has changed the world order. After that, former U.S. Solicitor General Neil Katyal, who sometimes you might see, I think he's on MSNBC, who has argued dozens of cases before the U.S. Supreme Court, along with Pulitzer Prize-winning Washington Post journalist Carol Leonig, to discuss the legal perils that our ex-president faces from fomenting the January 6th involvement, January 6th rebellion, riot, to electoral threats in Georgia. That'll be what's on the program on April 27th in 3 weeks. We've scheduled a two-part series in May on May 4th and May 25th, two experts' view of a topsy-turvy world. And on May 4th, we'll hear from the former chair of the Joint Chiefs, Navy Admiral Mike Mullen. And then on the 25th, we'll hear from Leon Panetta. Leon Panetta was former Secretary of Defense, former CIA director, former White House Chief of Staff, and former congressman. There certainly are not two more qualified people to learn from about America's place in the world and what's happening to the world. You can sign up for all of the programs I've mentioned in the email that you'll get after tonight's program. Also, our programs are now available to stream on your favorite podcast platform. You'll get a link to how to sign up and subscribe for podcasts. They usually come about the day after. Full unedited recordings of all of our programs can also be found on our website and our YouTube channel. Do not unsubscribe from our emails, otherwise you will not get the Zoom link. The only way to get on our programs is through a Zoom link. So if you unsubscribe, you won't get them, and we'll have to resubscribe you. Be sure to email me if that's a problem for you. Thanks to our leadership team, former Congressman Mel Levine, former Supervisor Zev Yaroslavsky, Caroline Kelly, Rabbi Ken Chasen, and David Lair, who is somewhere between JFK and Brooklyn right now, so he couldn't be with us tonight. We've included in every email a limited list of reputable organizations for donations to help the Ukrainians. It's in every one of our judge emails, and it's also up on our website. Be sure to look at the activism section of our website for voter suppression and opportunities to volunteer against voter suppression and to register more voters. We've got lots of organizations there that we vetted, and we hope that you will support those organizations. Our moderator tonight is Larry Diamond. He is a leading scholar in the field of democracy studies, an especially challenging discipline these days. He is a professor at Stanford University and on the staff of the Hoover Institution. He is the author and editor of countless books and articles in his field. He has been an advisor to governments and international organizations for decades, helping them to develop democratic institutions. We are indebted to him for securing our guest tonight, and we really appreciate, Larry, having you back tonight. You are always very generous to America at Crossroads, and we're grateful for your support and your expertise. Larry?
Thank you, Janice, and greetings to Mel and Zev and the entire community. I want to begin by introducing our two remarkable guests. Minxin Pei is the Tom and Margot Pritzker 72 Professor of Government and Chairman of the Government Department at Claremont McKenna College. A native of China with a PhD in government from Harvard, he is one of this country's premier scholars of China's communist political system. His books include China's Trapped Transition, The Limits of Developmental Autocracy, and China's crony capitalism, the dynamics of regime decay, which was named one of the best books of 2016 by The Economist magazine. He's now completing a new book entitled Guarding Dictatorship, China's Surveillance State. He's also a non-resident senior fellow at the German Marshall Fund of the US and was the inaugural Library of Congress chair in US-China relations in 2019. My colleague at Stanford, Kathryn Stoner, is senior fellow at the Freeman Spogli Institute for International Studies at Stanford, one of my two affiliations here, and is the Mosbacher director of Stanford Center on Democracy, Development, and the Rule of Law. She is one of the leading scholars of post-communist Russia, and she also obtained her PhD in government from Harvard a few years after Minxin. And in fact, they both taught at Princeton early in their academic careers. She's the author of numerous articles, book chapters, and books on contemporary Russia. Her most recent books are Resisting the State, Reform and Retrenchment in Post-Soviet Russia, and most recently, just last year, a widely talked about book, Russia Resurrected, Its Power and Purpose in a New Global Order. So welcome, Minxin, welcome, Kathryn. I'd like to begin with how Russia and China are presenting, or more precisely, propagandizing the war in Ukraine to their own people, and how each society is responding in public opinion. Now, of course, Putin's regime is guilty of brutal aggression, and it needs to quash all internal Russian opposition to the invasion. China's position, it seems, is a little more complicated. The authoritarian regime, it seems, Minxin, you can comment, has had a little bit of a more ambiguous public posture. So what are each of these two regimes saying about this conflict to their own people? And how is public opinion, such as it exists, responding? Are people in Russia and China able to get any independent information about what is happening? Kathryn, let's start with you and then go to Minxin.
Sure. Well, first of all, thank you very much for having me. I hope everyone can hear me okay. I'm assuming there'll be wild gesticulations if you cannot. Particular pleasure to be here with Larry, my close colleague and friend and sometime fellow dog walker here on Stanford campus, and Minxin Pei, my very old friend and almost classmate. I was actually at Minxin's his practice job talks, which is hard to believe, but I think it's 30 years ago for both of us. So good to see you. So it's a tragic moment, of course, to be getting together this way, because this is the biggest conflict, of course, so far the 21st century. Hopefully it won't get any bigger, and then also that it's in the heart of Europe and not in some little faraway place that Americans hopefully don't care about, but in the center of Europe, in a country of 44 million people, and that is Ukraine. And it was a completely unprovoked attack. So the question then, as Larry put it, is how do Russians perceive this? And the first answer is, well, we don't have super good information on this, but there are some polls. And so a recent poll was done by a reliable polling agency that is independent of the Kremlin. It's called the Levada Center. And it was a poll that was conducted with about 1,600 adults between March 24th and 30th of this year. It was done across Russia. So those of you who are really into the nitty-gritty of polling, happy to tell you what it is. But we have reason to think it's probably more or less reliable, but there are some validity issues I'll mention. But here's the shocking thing. So overall, when asked whether or not they support the activities of the Russian Federation's military in Ukraine, 81% said that they did. 53% support strongly, and 28% sooner support than not support. So 81% overall across all age groups. But then there gets to be a difference when you break it down by age. So younger people, not as supportive, 71%, that is 18 to 24-year-olds. But people over 55, I almost said older people, but that's me and Minxin and Larry here. So I happen to know. So I'll just say people over 55 who are not older, but older than the 24-year-olds. 86% of them support the war, and their support is more, let's say, intense. 64% fully support, and 22% of that 86 I mentioned sooner support than don't. The younger people a little less sure in their support, and that kind of tracks with their overall support of Mr. Putin. The urbanites tend to be less supportive than the ruralites, but overall, I mean, 81% is a big number. So, a couple of reasons to be a little bit circumspect about that. First, it's not clear how representative this actually is. It's usually, so what happens here is a poll taker comes up to your door, knocks on the door, so it's not by telephone, knocks on the door and says, will you answer these questions? So usually we get a 5 to 15% response rate. They haven't told us what the response rate is here, but there are other surveys going around right now where they're saying that they're getting a 5% response rate. So then that means that there's a sizable amount of the population just not wanting to participate at all, right? And so that says something. And then under these circumstances that Russian citizens find themselves in right now, where you can't even hold up a blank piece of poster board in Red Square right now that says nothing, you will be hustled away by the police. So then is there, sort of false representation of views? Well, we don't know, but under current conditions, this is, not unproblematic. And then the other thing is that, at the same time, a week and a half ago, we have 71% of 18 to 24-year-olds saying that they support this military action. 6 months ago, we had a poll that's done annually on this group, 18 to 24-year-olds, indicating that they wanted to, 41% of them wanted to immigrate, that is, leave Russia permanently. So, when we think of how thick that support is, that even of the young people, 71%, and how strong it is or intensive, it's a bit of a question mark. There's some contradictions. And then finally, of course, Russians don't have, without using a VPN, a virtual private network, access to any alternative information than what the state is providing right now. And that's new in the last 8 weeks, that all of that has been cut off. So no YouTube, no Twitter. The state television is an alternate universe, and I'm happy to talk about what Russians are seeing and the kinds of articles about denazification they are seeing. But okay. I should stop.
Thanks for getting us started on what is a fairly grim picture from within Russia. Minxin, how does it look from the perspective of the Chinese regime and Chinese public opinion and what the regime is telling their people?
Okay, if the story from Russia is grim, the story from China is complicated. China, the Chinese government essentially is sort of telling a two-part narrative. There's one part directed at the external audience, and there's another part directed at the internal audience. So let me briefly talk about China's narrative to the outside world. This narrative basically is that China is neutral. China wants to uphold its traditional principles of respecting national sovereignty and the territorial integrity of a country. And it's very sympathetic to the Ukrainians. But there's, of course, China's position is really quite pro-Russian. It's called pro-Russian neutrality, if there's such an Orwellian term. Inside China, what's interesting is that the Chinese media coverage of this war is not really as much as you see here. Here, you turn on TV, you look at the websites of major papers, and you see nothing but the coverage of the war. So in China, the war is not as extensively covered. So as a result, not a lot of people actually know a lot about what is going on. And what the official coverage minimizes Russia's military setback and does not really expose Russia's brutality, Russian troops' brutality in in Ukraine. So the picture, the narrative painted to the Chinese audience is quite pro-Russia. And another element is it blames the US. It does not blame Putin for the aggression. It blames the US for pushing NATO eastward, and it tries to justify Russia's aggression. So what do Chinese people think about the war? Unlike Russia, there are no polls conducted by reputable Chinese organizations. I have a friend who actually teaches at Stanford who uses some ingenious method to get some polling data quite methodologically decent from Chinese netizens, people who go on the internet. And it's a random sample, about 1,000 people. It turns out a plurality, about 40% support Russia. The rest, there's a minority, probably about 15, 20% are against Russia. Then you have a lot of people who don't know enough to make a decision on this. Interestingly, I think a lot of Chinese are getting the news about the war from Western media. The Chinese social media on the war is not as censored as on previous occasions. So that tells us something about how the Chinese regime is looking at the war. If I have to sort of make a guess, I think there are a lot of people inside the regime who are sympathetic or who are supportive of Putin, but there are also voices within the regime who are very skeptical about Putin's war in Ukraine.
Well, that raises questions about how close is and enduring is the strategic partnership between Russia and China. You both are well familiar with that famous meeting between Vladimir Putin and Xi Jinping on February 4th at the opening of the Winter Olympics, and that remarkable joint statement they issued in which they condemned internal interference in the internal affairs of other states. Obviously, they were talking about the US. They said there were no limits to their strategic partnership. And in what I think was a fairly Orwellian twist, they condemned, quote, unilateral approaches to resolving international problems and a resort to, quote, military policy, which is, of course, exactly what Russia has done in Ukraine since February 24th. So what's left of this strategic partnership between Russia and China? And is unlimited support what Xi is offering Putin? Minxin, why don't we start with you and then come to Kathryn?
Yeah, I would say this relationship began as a relationship or an alliance or an alignment of convenience. I would say a few years ago, but in the last 2 years, it became a relationship of necessity. That is, Russia and China find themselves really facing growing US pressure. In the case of China, we can talk about this later on, but in the case of Russia, Kathryn can sort of explain. I think the sense between the two is that they now have to embrace each other in order to have a chance to deal with mounting US pressure, especially security pressure on both of them. And whether it's the relationship has limits or not, I think we're looking at the relationship right now. Clearly, the relationship has limits because China is not going to support Putin the way Putin wants China to support him. Right now, we really have not seen anything that China has done that would cross the West's red line. And China doesn't want to do so because there are very important differences in terms of their assessment of their long-term fortune, their long-term relationship with the US. China is much more patient. Before the war, I believe that China still thought time was on its side. Now I'm not so sure. I think Putin clearly has scrambled China's timeline. So going forward, I think the next few months will be very crucial. If Putin's fortune deteriorates rapidly on the battlefield and at home, then he would really want China to come to his support. He wants Xi Jinping to really invest in this relationship, and that will put Xi Jinping on the spot. I think if push comes to shove, Xi Jinping will take more risks in supporting Putin because Xi now believes that his interests, his long-term survival, China's long-term strategic interests are now tied with those of Russia.
Kathryn, I would think that Vladimir Putin must be at least a little disappointed with the level of unlimited partnership that China has shown so far.
Sure, maybe. It's hard to know what's going on in his mind, and of course, and what he knows, and what he's being told. I would agree with Minxin. Obviously, in the last couple of years, I would go farther back than the last two, to even since 2014. Arguably, there's been a stronger and stronger relationship between the two of them. And in my book, this most recent book, I have a few sections on Russia and China and the relationship between these two autocrats who have not completely dissimilar life experiences to the extent that personal relationships matter. They're approximately the same age. They run, big countries. Those countries are running afoul of the United States in particular. And so the enemy of my enemy is my friend. I'm sure there's that element to it. Mr. Putin, when he went to the Winter Olympics just this past, I guess, February, now we're in April, 2 months ago, he was the first foreign leader Mr. Xi has seen in person, apparently, in 2 years. They have awarded one another, the highest honors that a non-citizen could get from their respective countries, and called one another their very best friends. And so it has gotten closer and closer. So what's the basis? And of course, this is a contrast to the Soviet period, when there was an infamous Sino-Soviet split over ideology and whatnot. So big change. So what is it? Well, yes, there is a personal affinity. I'm sure that's somewhat helpful between the two of them. They are both having troubles with the United States. That's a second thing, and that unites them. But the other is it's as Minxin said, not just an alliance of convenience anymore, and it's not based on ideology, except a dislike for Western liberalism, but they don't share the same ideology, other than strong state and keep the state against society. So the instead of convenience and neighborliness, it is necessity now. And so a lot of folks think that this is, and analysts will often say, well, the relationship is tilted surely in China's favor. And to some degree, of course, given the size of China's market and its economic power, that's true. But what fuels its production? And its GDP is falling right now, of course, right? So what fuels it? Well, relatively cheap oil and natural gas. And where is that coming from more and more? And I have a project that has been tracking this. And so really, since about 2014, it's gone like this to China, and it's coming from Russia. That's Russia's exports to China, and especially in terms of natural gas. That's hard to replace. You can't move natural gas as easily as you can move oil. So while China could find another supplier to keep its markets going and production going in that huge economy, if it was just looking for oil, well, it could get it from Nigeria or somewhere else. But natural gas is sitting right there next to Russia and next to them in Russia. And that's hard to transport other than through a pipeline. And so that's what's been built. There are big oil and new gas pipelines going across Russia into China. It's not perfect, but that's a lot of what it is. China has also got a coal shortage. Who's got a lot of coal? Russia. And they may have more now, since the EU looks like they're about to ban Russian coal there. What else does Russia sell China? Weapons. Russia is the world's second largest purveyor of weapons, conventional weapons. The largest is, of course, us, but Russia's big in this market, and China doesn't actually make that many of its own weapons. It buys most of them from Russia. Russia also sells nuclear power plants to China, and China is a big investor, or had been at least, in Russia. It can also hold Russian money. Although I'd be interested to hear from Minxin, how the Chinese are responding to the sanctions on Russia's foreign reserves. So I think that's, there are some very sort of clear benefits now to this alliance of necessity, as Minxin said.
Minxin, before I go on to another angle, Kathryn raised the weapons issue. I've heard speculation that Russia might actually start running out of certain kinds of military equipment and might need to turn to China for certain kinds of arms, maybe arms that it initially sold to China to keep going. Would the Chinese provide Putin with military equipment if asked?
Yeah, well, first of all, there are technical difficulties because the weapons that Russia would need would be made in China, and that they may not be compatible with the Russian training, so they would take some time. So to the extent that China is willing to give them the weapons or sell them the weapons, and Russia really needs them, it will not be used in the next few months. Probably 6 months later then. And China is supposed to be pretty good in terms of drones. And China also has very good anti-tank weapons. Russia has really good anti-aircraft missiles. So there were certain niche, and China has pretty good, I have a friend who studies these, and he told me that China has very good precision-guided munitions. But if China sells these weapons that are clearly marked, then it will cross a very bright red line. And I would say that China probably would not want to sort of do that. China wants to delay that as long as possible. So, just taking a step back, so I think the Chinese government must be relieved that Putin has lowered his war aims, which means that they don't have, so Putin cannot conserve his munitions and his forces, and China does not have to really be tested in terms of its ability to supply weapons to Russia.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. I want to ask a democracy question now. The February 4th joint statement that they issued was very weird and disjointed. On the one hand, they both claimed to be forms of democracy and warned that the West shouldn't impose its own forms. On the other hand, they obviously were very anxious about the spread of real democracy. And how does that anxiety affect each of the big regional conflicts? That is, Kathryn, to you, did Putin's fear of Ukrainian democratic success maybe spreading to Russia as an inspiration and model figure into his invasion? And Minxin, to you, does Xi Jinping's and his fellow communist leaders' fear of Taiwan as a model of democratic success perhaps help to drive what many people think is an eventual PRC pressure or military assault on Taiwan that's coming at some point in this decade? So Kathryn, to you first.
Sure. So the essence of this conflict is this. It is exactly what you say, Larry, that Ukraine's commitment to remaining a democracy. It was messy. It is fractious. The war has actually united all of the factions in the Ukrainian democratic tableau. Before this war, Zelensky, who's now sort of an international symbol of democracy and strength, he had an approval rating that was in the low 30%. He was about to put the former president of Ukraine on trial for treason, being talked out of that by the United States. It was a very lively democracy, an imperfect one, as democracies often tend to be, but intent on joining the European Union as well as NATO. So, you know, even if Ukraine said right now, we won't join NATO, and it is in the Ukrainian constitution that that is their aspiration, but of course they don't even have a membership action plan. I am very confident that that would not be enough to end this war, because that's not the threat. The threat is a demonstration effect. You know, this government came into power overthrowing, that is, this latest democratic regime came into power overthrowing first in 2004, you know, an illegitimate election in the Orange Revolution, and then from there in 2014, an increasing authoritarian kleptocrat who looked a lot like Putin in terms of how he was building his regime, and that's Viktor Yanukovych, who then ran away to Russia, and that's where he lives. And so that is that 2014 Maidan revolution, that people coming out on the street and demanding, you know, rights that he was not providing for them, and not signing an EU agreement that he had said he would sign. That is what Mr. Putin does not want, cannot have in Russia, because that's a threat to him personally and the resilience of his regime. And so that is what this is about. And in terms of timing, the moment seemed good, I'm sure, to him, sitting in his bunker, basically, in Sochi, when it looked like public approval of Zelensky was low. We made a mess pulling out of Afghanistan. American politics is fractious and polarized. There's a new chancellor in Germany, also fractious politics. Took a while to put that government together. We're ready with our war chest of foreign reserves. Our military is ready. Let's do it. And so, yes, but it's not about security, Russian security. Ukraine wasn't just about to join NATO. It was many years, maybe a decade, maybe never away. This is all about democracy, Larry, and Ukraine's commitment to it.
Yeah.
Well, Minxin, what about
Yes.
China, Taiwan?
Okay, well, China, Taiwan, I'll talk about the Taiwan issue later on. The Chinese Communist Party has always viewed democracy as an existential ideological threat, even when China and the West were on really good terms. We're talking about the last sort of before Trump, when there was engagement. The party knew very clearly, in sort of after Tiananmen, that it had to get China economically developed, but in the process preventing subversive ideas of democracy, freedom, human rights from influencing China. So that has been a consistent policy, and there's a strategy of preventing sort of equivalents of color revolutions from happening in China, because when Chinese people look at the West, until sort of fairly recently, they see very successful societies in terms of economic development, freedom, and just and how people can govern themselves. So for the last 10 years, China is trying to produce a counter narrative, wants to tell its own people that even though China is ruled by one party, the party actually has been quite successful. And that is the narrative China is trying to tell the rest of the developing world, with all kinds of sort of information, disinformation, influence operations. So in the case of Taiwan, I think it's a bit more complicated. The primary driver is not democracy. I would say the primary driver is nationalism. Because if you're familiar with the story between China and Taiwan, the narrative inside China is Taiwan is always viewed as part of China. The two places of split after the inconclusive of civil war. So that's I have to say that the Communist Party has done a very effective job in demonizing democracy in Taiwan. We look at Taiwan as a very successful democracy, but people in China see a very different story. What they have been fed is a diet of dysfunctional democracy, legislators hitting each other, all kinds of some undesirable things that China should not have. So I think in understanding the conflict between China and Taiwan, there is a very strong nationalist element, but there is also an anti-democratic and illiberal element in there.
Great. I mean, not great that's the reality, but
That is a reality.
a
We have
great
to,
succinct
yes,
answer to my question.
yes.
We're kind of entering a series of lightning rounds now, so that I can get in one more question and then a number of audience questions. So if I could encourage you to kind of give as concise answers
Okay.
as you can. I want to ask Kathryn first. This war hasn't gone well for Putin. Negotiations are going on. There aren't high expectations from them. Some have suggested Putin could fall from power. So how does this end? What is the minimum Putin must achieve, either on the ground militarily or in a peace agreement, that would enable the war to end, but at least Putin to think that he could survive in power?
So I think we, especially given the poll results that I noted at the beginning, I mean, although there could be problems with them, there probably is pretty much still a lot of robust social support for him. So would I expect big mass demonstrations on the streets demanding that he step down to take place imminently? No, that's not going to happen. The penalty of protest is so high. You can be arrested for just standing in Red Square with a blank placard that says nothing. Literally, you can be, and the penalty can be up to 15 years in prison. He has prepared for this by imprisoning people who could have organized social protest, like Alexei Navalny. And those opposition groups and leaders now live outside the country for the most part. They've been declared terrorist organizations. So that leaves us kind of with an elite, the possibility of some kind of elite removal or elite coup. And historically, the Russians and Soviets tend to do that better than they do, large-scale social revolutions. Even the Bolshevik Revolution wasn't really a big social revolution. It was kind of an elite coup by then. So how could that happen? Hard to see, frankly, and I'll tell you why in a minute or in a follow-up. But what would he have to achieve at minimum to stave something like that off, some sort of challenge? Well, probably at the very least, I mean, if you consider the main goal was probably to topple the regime and to take Zelensky out of power. And Putin clearly miscalculated there, thinking that Ukrainians are so divided that they will just throw bouquets of roses at tanks rather than Molotov cocktails. So they hate Russian incursion more than they hate one another. So failing that, I would think that at least getting eastern Ukraine, and that is the Donetsk and Luhansk, as they're called, People's Republics, to be annexed to Russia. But they actually occupy an area. Well, the area that they want to occupy is larger than what they do now. So that will probably go on for a while, that fight there. And then the city of Mariupol, and building a land bridge effectively to Crimea. And then some sort of guarantee of neutrality from Ukraine. And then they may pull back and wage basically an economic war to finish off the rest. That's a plausible minimum scenario.
Okay, thank you for that. And Minxin, briefly to you, do you think the fact that this war has not gone well for Putin, that he hasn't gotten hardly any explicit international support for it, may have given PRC leaders pause in whatever timetable they might have had in mind for using military force against Taiwan?
Oh, absolutely. I think China is watching this war very, very closely, and they've learned a lot of lessons. But these lessons are going to be costly for Taiwan and for the US in the future, because they are going to acquire a lot of weapons that will be much more effective. And I think pretty much you can rule out an invasion because that it's the least sort of a promising route. They're going to acquire a lot of long-range precision strike weapons because these are the weapons Russia appears to have used quite effectively. Of course, not against the military, but against civilian targets. And China will will have to really decouple itself from the rest of the world. So I think going forward, we're going to see a very ugly, dangerous, fragmented world. And so the sad thing is that if China actually becomes a gigantic North Korea, it will be a much more dangerous country. So I think the challenge for the West is how can we secure our allies without making our adversaries potentially less vulnerable. So that's so I would say the time horizon has been extended, but the probability is lower in the short term, but much higher in the longer term.
Well, that's deeply sobering, but unfortunately, I think deadly accurate. Let's go now to the broadest context for this, perhaps. Our listener EA asks, do either of you agree with Alfred McCoy's premise that China and Russia are, quote, pursuing a geopolitical strategy to break U.S. control over the Eurasian landmass and thereby break U.S. global power?
I want to correct. I think the U.S. does not have control over Eurasian landmass. I think these two countries have effectively. U.S. does have control over the global maritime realm, and these two countries are, of course, security considered. But both Russia and China are traditional great powers in the sense that they see their regions as their domain. They don't like the US to mess in their backyard. So China has a very explicit security agenda of pushing the US out of East Asia. And if China succeeds in doing so, I think the odds are stacked against China, by the way, then the US will cease to be global maritime power.
Yeah, do you want me to take a crack at that, Larry? So I don't think it's. I think the other part of this is I don't think it's quite as coordinated as the question implied in terms of a strategy where these two evil masterminds have sat down and decided, yes, let's work together against the United States. I do think, though, that they both advocate a multipolar world and thus, are united in that. What does it mean? Well, I think it means what Minxin just said. They do view the world in sort of this 19th century, even 18th century view of empires and great powers, and that we have a natural sphere of historical interest and stay out of it. And that implies that you do too, quote unquote, West. The problem is that's not how we think of international relations in the 21st century, right? So it isn't up to Vladimir Putin to decide for Ukraine and Ukrainians that they shall more or less be part of Russia. And that's basically what he's doing. What he's saying is that he's telling his people there are Nazis running that country, Nazis invoking the, Second World War, and where the Russians lost 20 million people, not just soldiers but people, to get his own population whooped up and rallying around the flag. And those Nazis hate Russians, and they are backed by the West. None of this, of course, makes any sense logically, right? But we're protecting Russia and by getting those Nazis, and we're hearing even young soldiers, said to villagers in Bucha, where that we've seen as evidence of just terrible crimes against humanity there, war crimes. That the questions they're asking are, where are the Nazis? So they've been told this as well, and so it's a perverse form of nationalism, but it's this idea that there is a greater Russia, and Belarus and Ukraine are integral parts of it, so they will take them back.
So a lot of questions that have been coming in, including from Gary and others, have to do with what China might do as this war goes on and pressure on it rises to come in some way, in a more concrete way, in a more tangible way, to Russia's aid. I would think, to draw you out a little bit further, Minxin, in the discussion we had earlier, she must be deeply irritated in one sense. This is not good for business for China. This is not good for China's steady ascent to, I think, in my opinion, the global hegemony that it ultimately is aspiring for. It's interrupting things and shaking things up, and it's not exactly showing the West to be a paper tiger. So what will China do to help Russia? We've talked about the military side. What about the economic side? And what risks does it run? And I'll ask you both, but we'll start with you, Minxin. If China comes to Russia's aid in a more concrete way, how do the United States and Europe respond to China? Minxin?
Yeah, I think it depends on sort of technically whether China helps Russia evade sanctions. Does China allow its banks to do transactions that Western countries forbid Russian banks from doing? So that's my sense is that this is the last line China would like to cross, because China can do a lot to help Russia economically. Not enough, of course, to offset the effects of sanctions. I think China can supply a lot of goods to Russia just to barter trade, because Russia now has a lot of oil that could be directed to China. And I think where they are constrained is really the gas, because they only have one gas pipeline, and constructing the second one, which they plan to do, will probably take longer, but I think they're going to accelerate that process. Other than that, I really don't think China can do a whole lot in helping Russia, but everybody helps as far as Putin is concerned.
Yeah, I would say the big thing they're doing, it's not, although it's symbolically very important, the United States has sanctioned oil and gas coming into the United States from Russia. Well, it wasn't very much. It's like maybe 5% of what we use. And the UK has done the same, or is starting, is ramping down what it takes in. The EU has not, because it's quite dependent, as we know, especially on natural gas coming from Russia, and natural gas, you have to, it's difficult to transport. So they're dependent there, and they're stuck there. But China is still buying a lot of oil from Russia, and so one thing it could do is buy more, right? That's a source of revenue for the Russian government, and thus the Russian war machine. And so that's an obvious, clear thing. The other thing they can do, of course, is invest in Russia. And there are still Chinese business people who can go into Russia and make deals, and they probably are getting bottom basement prices on a lot of things they could have had their eyes on. So I think those are sort of the most concrete things they can do without getting into this question of whether or not they're violating sanctions and annoying the West even more.
Kathryn, I'll ask you a question now from Howard that Janice might want to repose to Alexander Vindman when he comes on again, I think next week or soon. Do you think that Putin and Trump expected that Trump would be reelected and would pull out of NATO and basically give Putin a free walk into Ukraine? And then once Biden was elected, there was kind of already a plan set in motion that Putin wasn't going to go back on.
So that's That's certainly an interesting and plausible scenario. And Trump did, much better than we thought he would do, although it's not clear he had as much Russian help the second time in 2020 as he may have had in 2016. But sure, I think weakening NATO. Putin has been at this far longer than Trump has been at it in terms of weakening NATO and trying to also pull apart the European Union. By the way, which Trump was very much in favor of as well, right? Pro Brexit. I do think that's actually a plausible scenario, hoping that it would. And I think that's also a really interesting question that buttresses the point that this isn't really about NATO, right? So even if NATO hadn't expanded in Eastern Europe, and again, it didn't expand into Ukraine, and it wasn't about to expand, there was no agreement that triggered this. It's really about this idea of spheres of influence, and in particular, democracy. So the way Mr. Putin sees the world is everyone's manipulable. You can buy off everyone. And we may not, he may have something on Trump we still don't know about, by the way, and that's something to ask Alex next week, what he thinks about that. I've seen him answer it. And so, right, do you really think that, had NATO not expanded, Putin would be not in Ukraine today? I mean, of course he would. They'd be there sooner.
Yeah, I think you're right. Now let's, as long as we're thinking strategically, Minxin, let's pivot back to Asia. And Fran asks about this new phenomenon, not an alliance, but a significant partnership, the Quad, among Japan, Australia, India, and the US. Is it making any kind of difference in the strategic balance of power in Asia and the calculations that Beijing needs to make about the cost of military action?
Oh, absolutely. I think it's making a huge difference, at least in terms of perception. We don't know how robust the four countries will be militarily in the future. I think there were questions about Japan's involvement. And I think the biggest question is about India's involvement, because I think in terms of the war in Ukraine, India is sort of trying to sit on the fence. And but if you just look at the numbers, these two countries are very significant military powers. I think Australia has gone much farther than anybody else in that group to be with, or the other two countries, Japan and India, in terms of beefing up its military capabilities. We've just heard that Australia and UK and the US are going to develop hypersonic weapons together.
Mm-hmm. Well, we're coming up toward the end of our time. So the question I pose may be the last one. Tom Friedman, in a recent column, has called this the first real world war, in the sense of how global has been the public perception around the world of it. But it has a world element to it in a different sense, that China is increasingly a global power and intends itself to be such. Russia, resurgent, to quote the theme of your book, Kathryn, has wanted to reassert its power and standing in much of the world. And that is being felt, has been felt in recent years in several parts of the world, but quite interestingly in the Middle East. So I now will close with this question from Dorothea and come to you first, Kathryn, and then to Minxin. Please give a larger picture of how Russian and Chinese power is influencing, or I'd say at least penetrating, the Middle East. What are their roles in the region? And, how does this intersect with what could be another, this is how complex the world situation is now, very significant twist to the global picture in the coming months, which is potentially Iran breaking out to become a nuclear power. So, Kathryn, you first.
Sure. So, Dorothea, since I don't have a lot of time, I'm going to say this. Chapter 3 of my book, Russia Resurrected. And there is a section in there about the Middle East, and it's actually, it's don't read it before bedtime, because it really talks about the extent to which Russia has resurrected its influence in the Middle East. And one of the interesting sort of new dimensions in the Soviet period, they cared about spreading the ideology a little bit more. Under Mr. Putin, Russia doesn't care about ideology per se, right? So they will just as easily deal with the Israelis as they will with the UAE or with Syria or with Iran and Saudi Arabia, traditional enemies. And you can't help but notice that, when Mr. Biden called up the Crown Prince of Saudi Arabia, who's supposedly, Jared Kushner's good friend, to ask him to pump some more oil to bring global oil prices down from where they are right now, he didn't pick up the call. And the same with the United Arab Emirates. And OPEC has become OPEC plus, and the plus is Russia. So Russia and Saudi Arabia are now basically, setting with mechanisms of supply and demand, how much is available on the market, and therefore have tremendous influence together over oil prices. So I could say a lot more about that, and also relations with Israel, since this is a Jewish group, are much tighter with the Putin regime than you might be comfortable with, to be honest. There's also a lot of investment, of course, back and forth. So happy to talk more about that, but the best thing to do is probably to find some things that, like my book, that mention it. Sorry about that.
Your book, Russia Resurrected. Okay, Minxin?
Okay, I think as far as China is concerned, the biggest factor impacting the Middle East is really the US-China rivalry, because the US is pulling out of the Middle East in order to focus its efforts and resources on China. I think that is a game changer, and that is a structural change.
And created opportunity for Russia.
Yeah, great. So, but that actually has made a lot of interesting things happening. So you see key actors in the region trying to build new relationships. So there were 4 buckets: economy, ideology, technology, and security. China and most Middle Eastern countries are aligned in 4 buckets. They're all anti-democratic or non-democratic, with the exception of Israel. In terms of economy, China's thirst for energy, perfect, the greatest customer for the Middle East. And then in terms of technology, China can supply technology that will allow these countries to avoid getting sanctioned in the future. I think where the most complex bucket is security, because that's where the Middle East situation is really complicated. So far, China is very careful about getting entangled in the region's security, but in terms of building anti-democratic or autocratic alliances, deepening economic relations and technology, China and most Middle Eastern countries are on the same page.
Great. Well, so there have been so many excellent questions. I'm sorry that we have to end it there with a nearly record audience of almost 3,000 participants and many more watching their families' computers. But I do want to thank my dear friends and longtime colleagues, Kathryn Stoner of Stanford University and Minxin Pei of Claremont McKenna, for this exceptionally illuminating discussion. I want to thank Jews United for Democracy and Justice, Janice Kamener-Resnick, David Lair, and their colleagues for organizing all of this. Janice has put in the chat a means for you to contribute to these wonderful organizations if you so wish. I'd like to invite you to join us next week when PBS's Judy Woodruff will be with Martin Barron and in a conversation mediated by the Dean of the Annenberg School for Communication at USC and former head of Voice of America, Jeffrey Cowan, to discuss one of the urgent questions of our time. Is it possible to restore trust in journalism? And trust, I'm sure, will be another theme when Alexander Vindman joins us again, not long after next week's session. Thank you again for being with us today. And please join us next Wednesday, April 13th at 5 p.m. Pacific. Please stay healthy and pray for Ukraine. Thank you very much.